Good evening and thanks for joining us. My name is Susan Hay and I'm the president of Environment Haliburton. I'm very happy that you have joined us this evening. And for those of you on Zoom, I'm very happy that you have joined us as well. We're very excited to have Ralph Torrie as our speaker tonight. And I will be introducing Ralph in a moment. October 1st has been chosen by an organization known as Seniors for Climate and is a Canada-wide initiative to raise awareness about the climate crisis and what seniors can do about it. And Environment Haliburton is very proud to be part of this initiative. This is a hybrid event, and in that we have a real live audience, as well as those of you who have joined us via Zoom. And this technology is a little unfamiliar to us, and we hope you will bear with us. And we are very grateful for Tammy Ray's assistance in this with the technology. I'm going to give a brief land acknowledgement. Stan Rushworth, an Indigenous elder of Cherokee descent, reminds us of the difference between a Western settler mindset of I have rights and an Indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking that I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself. During Ralph's presentation, I would ask our virtual audience to please mute yourselves. And you can also turn off your camera if you want to multitask. Please type any questions that you have in the chat function, and they will be asked at the end of the presentation by Terry Moore, who will also be facilitating the Q&A at the end. And now I would like to introduce Ralph Torrie. Ralph has been working in the area of sustainable energy futures since the late 1970s, and his low carbon scenario analysis for Canada was the first such study in the world. He is the inventor of strategic planning software for local government climate mitigation that was used by hundreds of cities on 5 continents. In addition to his consulting practice, he served as assistant coordinator of the Energy Research Group of the United Nations University and the International Development Research Center as a senior executive of 2 publicly traded management consulting firms and as managing director of the Trottier Energy Futures Project. He was a Green Party candidate in 2 federal elections. Currently, he is Director of Research for Corporate Knights Incorporated, which is a leading sustainable economy media and research organization. Please join me in welcoming Ralph.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Such a pleasure driving up here. I mean, how could anybody refuse an invitation to Haliburton in the fall? Heaven on earth. It's a long road, and I was reminded of it when I met Terry this evening, because when I arrived at the University of Waterloo in September of 1970, he was already a big guy on campus, and really active in student politics, and then I lost track of him for a number of decades, and then he pops up where else? In the Haliburton Highlands. So it's good to see you, Terry. Maybe we shouldn't let it take another 50 years before we meet again. What I thought I would do is it's going to be a bit of a mixture of ideas and information, and some of it about big picture ideas, and some of it zeroing right in on the situation with our response to climate change here in Canada. But I want to start off with a map. This map is a map of the world made in 1490. And by the way, at that time, maps were treasures. They were fiercely guarded by the people that owned them. The people that made them were in high demand. And this was, at the time, the Martellus map was considered pretty much the best map in the world at the time, at least from a European perspective. And you can see There is no, the Americas are not represented. I mean, everybody knew the world was a globe or sphere of some sort, but nobody was really sure what was beyond the horizon. Africa is a bit comical in its shape. The reason I'm putting this up here is to contrast it with this map. This was considered one of the best maps in the world just 17 years later. And you can see that America has started to reveal itself as what looks like a big barrier island that got in the way of the Europeans who sailed west thinking they would find China, instead bumped into the Americas, what we call the Americas. 17 years. And I think it's very hard when you're inside a big transition or a big change like the one that we're undergoing right now to always appreciate how quickly things can change when our understanding changes of where we really are in the scheme of things. So here is one 17-year period in history where our understanding of where we were relative to other things evolved very, very quickly in response to information and research and exploration. Of course, everybody knows, especially Australians, this is the way the world looks today. And we continue to broaden our understanding of just where we are in the scheme of things physically. It wasn't that long ago when we thought the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun revolved around the Earth. And the only way that you could fit the evidence to that understanding was to fit the evidence of how the planets moved, was to invent these beautiful loop-to-loop so-called Ptolemaic epicycles of the crazy pathways the planets must be on in order to make sense of the Earth being in the middle of it all. And it wasn't until Copernicus came along and said, oh, what if the sun was in the middle? And then suddenly all of the orbits became simple elliptics, and we developed a whole new understanding just of our own little solar system, which of course we now understand is part of a suburb of a galaxy with hundreds of millions of other stars, which in turn is part of a universe with millions of other galaxies. And a lot of this understanding has billions of other galaxies. A lot of this understanding has developed only recently. When our way of seeing things changes, then whole new possibilities open up that are just not even visible in the old way of seeing things. Let me bring this to the environmental issue. Many of you have probably seen versions of this so-called Venn diagram. We have the environment in the green circle, the economy in the blue circle, and society in the red circle. And sustainability, sustainable development, whatever term you want to use, is then portrayed as the intersection of these three spheres. I've never liked this diagram. And if you stop and think about what's wrong with it, it becomes obvious on a moment's reflection that a good part of the environment in this diagram, well, let me start with the economy. A good part of the economy in this diagram is outside of the environment. It's outside of society. What I'd like to know, what kind of economic activity could possibly take place outside of the environment? Never mind outside of society, given that the economy itself is a social construct. So there's a problem with even this way of looking at things. When it was first introduced in the Brundtland Commission days in the 1980s, was considered a great step forward in thinking about sustainability. I think that now, much as our understanding of where the Earth resides in the solar system has moved from the center to more the periphery, so has our understanding of how to look at these different phenomena, and that our human economy is embedded completely within society, which is a much larger and more complex thing than the economy. And all of that is totally and completely embedded within the ecosphere in which we find ourselves. That simple change in thinking is enough to make one begin to reconsider how we have to behave in order to make this sustainable. There's a few basic rules that we now understand about this place. I'm sure you've all seen these before. Number one, everything goes somewhere. This basically means there's no such thing as waste. Waste is an economist's concept. You'll never find an ecologist using it. It doesn't make any sense in ecology. Everything is connected, which means you can never really just do one thing, try as you might. Every time you do something, you're doing things that you weren't intending to do. Maybe good, maybe not. Probably you won't even know what they are until after they've happened because of the complexity of the system in which we're living. So a good deal of humility is required to live properly in this place, given these interconnections and the extreme complexity of the Earth system. And then finally, and I don't know if any of you ever had the pleasure of knowing or meeting Ursula Franklin, who was a great Canadian, the first female engineering prof at the University of Toronto, a professor of mining engineering, a Quaker, a founder of the Voice of Women. The list goes on and on. Order of Canada, chairman of the Science Council. And she would often make this point when she addressed the environmental and the energy crisis, that nature is an independent power. You can't negotiate with nature. You can't sit down at a table and say, you know, that climate change thing, we were thinking of offering a 20% reduction. How does that sound? Not listening. It's just physics and chemistry. And the sooner that we understand that and realize that the key to sustainability for human society is to live within the planetary boundaries and these three simple rules of how this place works, the better off we will be and the better prospects our children and grandchildren will face. Okay, what are we doing? This chart, and you can see on the far right-hand side where the line goes vertical, this is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, going back to 800,000 years, basically, before the present. So you can see that, yes, there have been ups and downs. There have been natural cycles that have occurred as ice ages have come and gone. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have gone up and down, but nothing, absolutely nothing that comes close to comparing to what we have done just since the industrial society started. This is a hammer blow. If there's any mathematicians or physicists in the audience, you'll recognize this as a delta function. When you deliver this kind of a large, sharp blow or signal to a complex system like the Earth climate system, you have no idea what kind of havoc it's going to unleash or how that system is going to respond. You cannot compare the way the system will respond to a blow like this to these much smaller and more gradual cycles that have characterized history. The historic record, I should say, going back, and even the prehistoric record, going back all those hundreds of thousands of years. What we are beginning to understand is that as we put these gases up in the atmosphere, it's like putting an extra blanket on your bed at night. The heat gets trapped under it. The temperature goes up. The energy has to go somewhere. It manifests itself as melting ice, as more intense storms, as more intense heat waves, which in turn lead to the wildfires and the other extreme weather events, which we've all come now to associate with advancing climate change. And everything that you're seeing now, from Jasper to Lahaina to Paradise, California, to closer to home storms here in Ontario, all of that is the result of the emissions that we put up into the atmosphere up to 10 or 20 years ago. The system doesn't respond instantly when the emission concentration goes up. It takes time. And it has a lot of inertia. And we're in for a rough ride now, no matter what we do. We have to be honest and face up to that. The economic costs of what we have already set in motion are going to be enormous. Never mind the costs in human suffering. It's here now. It's here in Ontario. This is a picture of the drought in Flamborough Township in 2016. This is a wildfire in Key Harbor. It's a 2018 picture. We all know that some of the fires that we're seeing now are not like fires like anything that we've seen in the past. I'd recommend the book Fire Weather to those of you who are interested in that particular topic. A great book about how fire is changing, with a large section on the Fort McMurray fire of a few years ago, excuse me, which exemplified these super fires that are now starting to result from the conditions that we're creating through climate change. These were floods in Minden, Ontario, just a few years ago. Ottawa. This is in the outskirts of Ottawa. I lived in Ottawa for 18 years. You never would think of it as being a place where you had to worry about tornadoes. But these tornadoes have started to show up in places like that. And this wasn't the last one that's occurred up there. So, what do we have to do to address this problem? Excuse me. The way that I approach that question, given the complexity of the system that I referred to a moment ago, is you look for what are the principles that would characterize a sustainable energy system, and let's build our human energy systems by adhering to those principles. So the first thing you would notice and this is basically an application of what sometimes gets called biomimicry, you take a look at the way nature does things, because it's really, if you're looking around for an example of sustainability, that's pretty well the only game in town. Look at the way nature has managed to develop the systems that characterize the way the ecosphere functions, and try and embed those ideas and those design principles in human technology. And maybe you have a fighting chance of developing a human technology which will conform to those three simple rules of the ecosystem that I was referring to earlier. So the first one you're going to notice is, well, this runs on renewable energy, first of all. Secondly, that's a cue for the next bullet to come up. Thank you. It's really efficient. I said earlier, there really isn't any waste in nature. Everything gets what it needs without more than it needs. And the output of one organism is the input for another one. So there's a very highly efficient matching of people's needs for energy with both the size and the quality of the energy sources. Obviously, you don't want anything that's going to generate growth in greenhouse gas emissions beyond the level that the Earth system is able to breathe back in again. You'll be looking, as I've already mentioned, for a circular flow of materials, no radioactive waste or toxic waste. In fact, no waste at all. I'm describing an ideal here, okay? So don't get too discouraged. It would be resilient and diverse. When their failures occur in such a system, they would be safe failures. They wouldn't require elaborate engineering systems to prevent them from being dangerous, even productive. It would not be capable really of generating ecocidal risk. And by that, I mean risks which threaten the viability of the whole system in which it's embedded. And finally, and this one maybe is a little more debatable, it would reinforce our cultural values for me, that means equity, accessibility, self-determination, community autonomy, and what Ivan Illich called conviviality. In other words, technologies, while you may not understand them, I don't understand how my cell phone works, but that's a convivial technology in the sense that most days I feel like I control it and not the other way around. And it's not going to kill me if it fails. And it makes life better on balance, I would argue. Maybe that's not the best example of conviviality, but it's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Obviously, there's no individual human technology that's going to check off all of these boxes. These are not characteristics of technologies. These are characteristics of the whole system. So what you're looking for in any individual technology are technologies which do as best as we can at being consistent with these design principles of a sustainable system. And when you apply that kind of thinking to how we get out of the heat trap that we've developed with the greenhouse gas issue, there's basically, I think, 5 key things that are going to have to be part of the transition away from the corner that we've sort of backed ourselves into. Efficiency of fuel and electricity use always comes to the very top of the list. It doesn't always get the attention it should, but the improvement in efficiency has been greater than all of the new sources of energy added together in this country in contributing to our energy security for the last 50 years or more. And that has to just continue. Our system is still pathetically inefficient. It's unbelievable. We move a 3,000-pound SUV or a 4,000-pound SUV to carry a 100-kilogram passenger a few miles to get a 200-gram quart of milk. I mean, it's hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. And you can find these kinds of examples when you stand back and look at our system with an ecological lens everywhere. We have a long, long way to go in terms of developing efficient, elegant technologies and approaches to the way we live here. This next point was not always the case. When I first started doing work in this field, we tried to avoid becoming too dependent on electricity because we didn't know how we would ever come up with a sustainable supply. When I say when I first started doing this kind of analysis, I'm talking about 1980, 81. So now with the advent of solar and wind and battery storage and all of the new digitization technologies that make a much more efficient use of the grid and electricity possible, and the fact that at the point of end use, electricity doesn't emit any greenhouse gas emissions, which pushes the problem to the power plants, makes it smaller and more manageable, has moved electricity right into the center position of how we are going to need to respond technologically to the climate crisis. There's a strong consensus on this now. It wasn't there 20 years ago, but it's there now. It's not just electricity. There will be a role for district heat and some other zero emission sources, perhaps bioenergy, but electricity and electrification of things like transportation and building heat is critically necessary to successfully getting through this. And of course, that means the electricity supply, as I sort of inferred a moment ago, needs to be free of carbon. There's different ways to do that. We Greens prefer that it be done without nuclear. Some people think nuclear needs to be part of that. But either way, the supply of electricity needs to be free of carbon if this whole electrification strategy is going to work. Even if you electrify, by the way, while your grid is still not zero carbon, you still come out ahead because the electricity technologies are so much more efficient than the fossil fuel technologies they replace. An electric car uses, I think, a quarter or a fifth of the energy of a gas-powered car. A heat pump uses electricity, but it's actually, when you think about it, solar energy that it's pumping into the building. And for every unit of electricity it consumes, it can provide in a climate like Southern Ontario, 2.5 or a little more than 2.5 units of heat to the interior. So that's like 250% efficiency if you want to look at it, electricity in and heat out. And so because of that, electrification brings these enormous efficiency gains that are going to be part of how we escape, if we can get out of this trap that we've built for ourselves, how we do it. I mentioned that there will be a role for biofuels. They haven't been harvested and developed very sustainably in the past. So we're going to have to clean up the way that we manage our forests and do this if the biofuels are truly going to be sustainable. I'm not talking about those of you who are using woodlots to heat your homes here in Haliburton. I'm talking about the massive application, including clear cutting in many cases of forests, to feed large power plants to make electricity. It's not sustainable. So yeah, there could be a role for biofuels, but there's going to have to be an improvement in the way that the forests and the feedstocks are harvested and managed before that could really be labeled as sustainable. And then, and I would say, even if we do all of these things, even if we can improve the efficiency of our energy system, electrify our transportation and our buildings, bring on the solar and the wind and the batteries and the advanced technologies to create a carbon-free electricity supply, enhanced perhaps with sustainable biofuels. Even if we do all of these things, we cannot keep growing the way we've been growing. I'm as guilty as anybody of promoting the technical fix to this problem because it's just the way my own sort of professional career developed. But in terms of my own values and my own opinions, we're not getting out of this unless we can address consumerism, unless we can answer the question, when is enough enough? Unless we can find a more gentle and ecologically more less harmful way to get the things that we really need without this continuous pressure that there has to be more all the time. There's some complications with respect to the situation. This isn't the only, first of all, as I've already mentioned, climate is going to, the problem's going to get worse no matter what we do. We've locked in quite a bit of deleterious climate change. It's coming, it's here. People are dying and communities are burning and being flooded. It's getting pretty bad. We're in one of the most protected areas on the planet here in Southern Ontario. And even here, we're starting to feel it. But in parts of the South, in particular South Asia and so on, climate change is wreaking havoc and has been now for many years. The time frame for the transition away from fossil fuels, and this is a fossil fuel problem, let there be no misunderstanding, 80% or more of the emissions in this country are from the production and combustion of fossil fuels. So we've got to stop doing that. You know, we've had this relationship with fire that's been going on now for a long time. It's time to move on. It's not really working for us at this point. It's causing problems that eventually could be our undoing. And we have to do it fairly quickly. In the next 1 or 2 capital cycles, I think, for the rich countries, or else there are feedback loops that will start to accelerate, which could make the whole thing unmanageable and uncontrollable. I've made this third point already. Nature is not our enemy, but an independent power. We've got to figure out what needs to be done in order to be sustainable and do it. Not then say, well, let's do half of it. And the transition itself, you know, it's all about fossil fuels, but there's a lot of big systems that share nothing else in common except that they end up burning fossil fuels. So the transportation, the personal transportation and the freight transportation system, 2 very different systems. They share the road, but it's different vehicles, different technologies, different economics, different possibilities. The same is true for residential and commercial buildings. Buildings themselves, a very different set of economic and political and cultural circumstances as compared with transportation. And so one of the things that makes this such a wicked problem is that there isn't just one solution. There are many solutions, and there are probably 10 big systems that all have to undergo fairly transformative change before we will get through to the other side of this transition. But remember those early maps and how quickly things can change once you begin to realize that there is a possible way forward that is sustainable and looks different from where we've come from. So the final bullet on this slide that was up when we had the interruption refers to the importance of local circumstances. I talked about some of the big things that have to be part of this transition, the efficiency, the electrification, and so on. But how that actually happens varies from one place to the next. This is why local climate literacy, including in town halls and town councils and township councils, is so important. I'll come back to that in a few minutes before I wrap up. Okay. I'm going to move on. More good news. The cost of these solutions that I've been talking about has been coming down faster than anything that we've ever seen in the history of energy and energy technology, faster than oil and gas and coal ever came down. These remarkable drops in the cost of solar energy, wind energy, batteries is one of the really important parts, one of the really important good news stories in this whole story. The left hand here shows the International Energy Agency's index of clean energy prices. And you can see there was a little bit of an uptake in 2022, but the big story is that it's come down from somewhere around 240 to 100. So way below 50% of what it was just 10 years ago. If you go back further, the declines are even greater. The solutions are actually growing faster than the problem. This is one of the things that keeps us, gets us up in the morning and going at corporate nights where I work, is we're working on the promotion of these solutions, on informing and educating investors in particular about where the opportunities are for the electric cars and the solar PV and so on. And the growth rates are phenomenal, but the signals are still quite small. So you have this kind of interesting comparison of a problem which is already fairly large and is also growing, and a set of solutions which are very tiny, but which are growing at a much faster rate than the problem. So it's a big race. And I don't know if I'll live long enough to see how it comes out, but we're hoping, and a lot depends on it being the case, that we can keep growing these solutions fast enough and quickly enough that we can stop the increase of atmospheric emissions of greenhouse gases, and thereby begin to bring some stability back to the global climate system. Another way of looking at this, there's much more money being invested in these cleanest solutions than in the legacy economy, and this gap is widening. On the left hand, you see growth in clean energy investment measured in trillions of dollars. Again, this is International Energy Agency data. On the right hand, you see investment in fossil fuels and what's been happening to that from 2019 to 2023. Oh, you can't see what I'm doing, so I should stop pointing.
Oh, it's okay, they can at home.
Yeah. We have to keep this growth happening. We did a look at this initially in the midst of the pandemic at corporate nights. We did some research on what we thought it would take to decarbonize the Canadian economy. We came up with about $126 billion per year. This was work that was done in 2020. The first two bars are buildings. The top one is what we need to spend per year on residential retrofits. Second one, commercial buildings. The third one, zero emission transportation, electric vehicles and chargers, renewable electricity investment, and then actually somewhat smaller capital investments required for the decarbonization in heavy industry and agriculture. 126 billion, it's a lot of money. But here, just to provide some context, our current climate investments, we think, are in the range of maybe $20 billion a year in Canada in the solutions, compared to that 125 to $140 billion that we estimate it needs to be, a number which has since been corroborated by a number of other sources, including that same range was listed in the last federal government budget. The Royal Bank study of this came up with a similar number. If we don't do it, it's going to be more expensive. These floods and these fires and these droughts and these heat waves, they do not come without a cost, not just in human lives, but in reconstruction. And it's an enormous cost, and it's just going to continue to grow until we can get this problem back under something of control. Just by way of comparison, the federal response to COVID, we spent about $250 billion on that 2 years in a row. I don't remember anybody saying if it was worth it, asking that question. maybe after they did, but at the time, what was our response? We have to do what we have to do. That's the way the whole world responded. That's what an emergency response looks like. When the first question that gets asked is, can we afford it? Probably you don't really believe it's an emergency. Because if you really believe it's an emergency, that's not the first question you ask. If your kid gets diagnosed with cancer, the first thing you ask is, oh, can we afford to deal with this? See, what do we have to do? We have to do whatever it's going to take. We're not there with climate change. And I don't know, after all these years, with the consequences getting more and more severe, what it's going to take, but we're clearly not there yet. The federal government's recent decision to keep Chinese electric vehicles out of Canada, which are quite affordable, very nice cars. Yes, there are problems with Chinese supply chains, but that would have been a big boon for addressing climate change in Canada, because right now the average Canadian cannot afford an electric vehicle because the Western car makers don't make affordable electric vehicles. Cheapest one you can buy in this country is 40,000, and most of them are over 50. But climate change was just not a big consideration when the tariffs were being considered. I can go on about that one, but I'll resist unless you want to come back to it in the question period. Breaking this down, the total amount that we need to invest in our transportation system between now and 2050, probably around $600 billion. It could be a lot less if we're able to, if we could get more affordable electric vehicles, you could cut this in half. Do you know how much we spend every year on our road transportation system in this country? About 225 billion every year on the vehicles, the fuel, the maintenance, the insurance, 30 billion alone on the roads and infrastructure. So yes, 600 billion, which works out to what, 30 billion a year for 20 years. It's a lot of money, or 20 billion a year for 30 years, but it's actually a relatively small number compared to what we routinely are spending every year in the transportation sector. I'm going to move along a little bit more quickly. I'm actually going to leave some of these slides for you to look at. The slide deck is going to be made available because I don't want to overstay my welcome here. So I moved ahead several slides now, and just summarizing some of the work we've been doing on the transportation sector. Here you can see the capital cost premium that I was referring to is the downward red bar, about $600 billion between now and 2050. The green bars represent, number one, the fuel savings, even after taking into account the cost of the electricity to power those vehicles. The second green bar is what we'll save in maintenance, very conservative assumptions. And the third bar is what we will save in avoided cost of carbon. As you can see, this particular part of the climate change solution has got very, very positive economics associated with it. If we can just get it moving faster, it's going to pay back. If we look at the buildings gap, I've already said a bit about this. Here we have, we think, we can see it's split more or less evenly between residential, the red, and commercial buildings, the blue. This is a big piece of our greenhouse gas emissions in this country. Our findings on that, again, I'm speeding up here in order to save a bit of time. Emissions from commercial buildings have been more or less steady over the last, since 2002. For residential buildings, they've actually been declining. This is one of the good news stories within the climate system, climate energy system, is that our greenhouse gas emissions, as represented by this black line in Canada, have been going down in the residential sector over the long term, even as our population has been increasing and as the number of houses have been increasing. So the efficiency investments and the electrification that is happening, even with the level of effort we're putting in now, has been sufficient to bend this curve down. It's not on a track to zero by 2050, not even close, but at least it's heading in the right direction, and it's something that we can build on and accelerate. Here again, roughly similar to the transportation sector. We think that we need about a $30 billion injection per year to get this job done every year for the next 20 years or more, 25 years. Again, big number, yes. You know how much we spend on buildings in Canada? About $150 billion every year. About half of that on new buildings. The other half is what we spend in renovating our buildings. We spend $75 billion a year in this country renovating our homes and our office buildings, most of it homes. It's not climate renovation, it's kitchens, bathrooms, and marble countertops, okay? But the point is that there's a culture in this country of investing in the buildings. We can work with that, we can build on that. The overall magnitude of the problem doesn't scare me. What's missing is that motivation that we had for COVID, that we had for other historical crises that we face as a country, but which we have not yet really embraced when it comes to climate change, where we may say it's an emergency, but when you look at our actual response, you don't see it. I want to end by just saying a little bit about local agencies. Since we're here in Haliburton, this is about as local as it gets. I made the point earlier that active engagement of local government is essential to this response. There's a lot of reasons for this. The local governments are closest, obviously, to the ground in making some of these systems change. Local governments have enormous influence over the level and the pattern of greenhouse gas emissions in the community, whether it's their investment in transportation systems, they control the building permits in the community, they control the planning of land use, whether the community is laid out in a way that makes transportation friendly. They usually control and directly invest in the public transportation systems. There's just a long list of ways that local governments influence the level of pattern greenhouse gas emissions. As I said earlier, also, addressing these problems at the local level is a way of meeting other community aspirations, including economic development and employment generation. But the individual details of these solutions are going to vary from one community to the next. This is just a list. I was saying earlier, all of the different ways that local governments influence the level and pattern of emissions, roads, transportation systems, recreation, cultural facilities, police, safety, protection, social housing, business and economic development strategies and policies. The land use planning is a big one. The operation and ownership and pricing of public transit parking is another big one. The pattern of public and private investment in the community is largely influenced by local government policies and bylaws, the future urban form, the whole storm sewage and drainage infrastructure, the solid waste management system, significant greenhouse gas issues there, the water supply, the sewage treatment infrastructure, local government's own use of fuel and electricity is not tiny. It makes a difference. Local governments often either own or have control or board positions on hospitals, utilities, school boards, community centers, and so on. So local governments are cotter pins in any effective response to climate change. In fact, I would say that local government policy and bylaws and planning is climate action planning, whether it's recognized as such or not, that the actions and the investment strategies and what people do not only through their local governments, but as communities more generally, is going to be quite important in the transition to the post-fossil period. This graph is just a reminder of how long some of these decisions stay in place. The longest, the land use planning, it can affect the level of energy use in the community for 100 years into the future. Same thing with urban infrastructure. So there are very long cycles on some of the investments that determine the level of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you get it wrong, it can be a long time before you get a chance to fix it. interesting, in some survey work that was done recently in Canada, communities that had local action plans for addressing climate change were asked why they were doing it. None of them, who had community energy plans, I should say. And a lot of communities in Ontario do have community energy plans now. And when asked, well, what was the motivation? Economic benefits was at the top of the list. The money that leaves the community to buy fuel and electricity, a little bit of it stays in the community for the local utility management of the distribution system, but most of it is out of the community. A lot of it is out of the province. Much of it is out of the country. So there is a great, the economists would say, an import substitution benefit to investing in efficiency and energy efficiency in particular in your community. It comes back in many ways to benefit the local economy. Environmental benefits, in particular, air quality was often mentioned. The resilience that it brings to the community, the sense that they have a little bit more independence from being dependent on the big central energy system was mentioned. The health benefits, the social benefits. So this idea that it's those collateral benefits that really matter when you are designing and trying to build support for local climate plan in your community. It's really true. Collaborate, leverage, try to understand what it is that really motivates the stakeholders. Greenhouse gas emission reductions will be on the list for some of them. But some of them just want to own a home. They want affordable housing. They want to be comfortable. They want convenient access to shopping and services. The list goes on about all the things that really motivate people. If you can push those buttons in the development of your local climate action plan, you have a much better chance of building the political and community support you need for raising the necessary capital and political support for implementation. So that's nearly an hour. I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly with a few words about electricity in Ontario, because it's something that I've been working on for a long time, and which again is central to the way that we're responding to climate change and the way that we're thinking about our future energy system. What you see in this graph here is the total annual consumption of electricity in Ontario from 2003 to 2023. If you ask most people, they would say, oh, electricity growth, it must be just going through the roof. Not. It's actually peaked in 2005. And we have gone now for almost 20 years on a downward slope with electricity use in this province, even with a healthy and growing economy, even with a growing population. There are many things that feed into this, including structural change in the economy, energy efficiency, and all of that. But the point is that and this has happened to me many times in my life, and I just by way of telling a story, when I first got involved, and actually it was one of the things that got me involved in energy issues as a young physics graduate. I wasn't even a graduate yet in the late 1970s, was that Ontario Hydro had put forward a plan for the future of the province's electricity system that involved, I think it was 65 nuclear plants post-Darlington and 42 or 43 big coal-fired plants, all of which had to be online by 2005 or the lights were going to go out. And they tabled that, and Bill Davis was the premier at the time. Darcy McHugh was the treasurer. And they basically freaked out because the capital that would have been required to build such a system would have absorbed all of the investment capital that would likely be available to the province of Ontario. So they called a halt to it. They appointed Arthur Porter, who was the Dean of Engineering at the University of Toronto, as to head up a royal commission to try and understand what had gone off the rails so badly with electricity planning in Ontario that a utility could actually seriously table such a obviously and transparently, ridiculously impossible plan. None of those plants, not one of them was ever built. As you saw, the electricity consumption in this province has been in decline now for the last 20 years, but it really didn't grow much before that either. They were assuming that electricity would have to grow in order for the economy to grow. That turned out to be a very, very wrong assumption. That was in a class with the Earth is in the middle of the solar system type assumption. Electricity is in the middle of the economy sort of thing. People don't want electricity. They really don't. I mean, you don't want a kilowatt hour in your hand. You want the things that can do for you. And the list is pretty short. The things that drive the economy, that drive everything we want to be. We want to be healthy. We want to be comfortable. We want to be safe. We want to be happy. If I missed anything, I got 4. There might be a 5th one. That's about it. And everything else flows from that. And when you see a business like the electric utility industry lose sight of that underlying driver, then they no longer see. Remember, we talked about how the way you see the system determines what opportunities you see and what possibilities you see. When you only see electricity and you have yourself convinced that in order for the economy to go up, electricity consumption must go up, you don't even see what's going on underneath the surface. And so you put a plan like the one I just described on the table, and common sense, hopefully, at that point comes into play, which it did in that case. But then it came up again in 1989. Hydro said, okay, the transition is over. We're not growing at 7%. Now we're going to grow at 2.5%. And we're going to have to build more power plants. And again, an environmental assessment was called to take a look at it. None of those plants were ever built. The gap never materialized. The environmental assessment was canceled because there was no point in it. And we went through all of the 1990s with almost no growth in the demand for electricity. Even though the population and the economy were growing and Ontario Hydro had gotten out of the conservation business, we shut down a good portion of the nuclear fleet in the mid-1990s to fix it. Lights didn't flicker. And it was largely what was going on the demand side. Our economy was decoupling from the growth in demand for electricity. And then again in 2005, there was a sense that the system was going to start to grow again. And we had to start building. The demand, as I was showing you a moment ago, is now about 15 or 20 terawatt hours. So more than 10% below in absolute terms where it was in 2005. When the McGuinty government, in this case, committed to those gas-fired plants. We're in another era now. I'm not saying that the electricity system doesn't need to grow in order to accommodate the electric vehicles and the heat pumps. It will. But when you look at the whole system and what's possible with efficiency and the advantages that the switch to electricity brings with it in terms of lower energy consumption, I don't think the system needs to double. I think it's more like a 50% increase over the next 25 years. I think it'll be well into the 2030s before electricity consumption in Ontario even gets back to where it was in 2005. So the panic over the adequacy of our electricity system, I can't sign on to it. I've just seen too many instances in the past where this kind of gapology, as I call it, has manufactured this sense that the sky is falling, and if we don't immediately start building more big power plants, because they take, they want to build nukes, and those things take 15 years, then we're not going to have electricity in the 2030s. I think we can afford to, and I think we would be well advised to take a much more deliberate, cautious approach, make sure we're getting all of the efficiency that we can and which is economic, make sure that we're accelerating the new and distributed renewable resources as quickly as we can, and they're growing like gangbusters in the rest of the world. We're on the risk of sort of falling behind in the nature of our energy system here. So there's a different way of seeing the future when you come to the climate change challenge. If you respond to it through the lens of the old paradigm, through Ptolemy's way of looking at the universe, you're going to come up with solutions that will not work. But if you can make that transition towards thinking about an energy future, which is designed and built to stay inside the planetary limits, it turns out that once you start exploring that space and drawing the map of what that world looks like, it's a pretty good looking map. It's a place that you want to go to. It offers a future which may be the ultimate challenge for this human story that stretches back so many thousands of years, as to whether or not we're smart enough and we are capable of figuring out how to live here, because we're not going to Mars. This is it. This is our home. It's a beautiful blue dot, as David Suzuki likes to describe it. Nobody's coming to rescue us. We're just a tiny little speck in the scheme of things. But in our world, this is, I think, what the environmental crisis really presents to us is a test like no other of humanity, because the environmental crisis in the final analysis is a human crisis. It's a human challenge. It's human in its consequences. It's human in its origins. But what's most interesting and in some ways most exciting to me, it's human in the sense that it presents a choice. And if we choose the sustainable future, then we can make it happen. There's no laws of physics, there's nothing that permits this sustainable future to be labeled as impossible, except a lack of imagination. And I'll just leave it there. That's a whole hour I've subjected you to, so I'll thank you for
So we do have about half an hour before we have to exit. So we have a good amount of time for questions or comments directed at Ralph and some dialogue. And what I'll try to do is pay attention to the folks who are online. And I'm going to encourage you that are online to please put any comments or questions that you want to pose in the chat box, and I'll routinely go through those. So I'm going to alternate back and forth between the folks that are here and the folks that are not here, but online. So I wanted to ask, does anybody want to put your hand up and ask a question or make a comment right away? Here, right now? Judy.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I really liked your presentation. So hopeful. I was thinking about cities that have grants for heat pumps, something very concrete. So is that kind of your idea of, local and collaborating? And, because we've got provinces that aren't, delivering on that, some federal grants, but again, the cost of heat pumps. So to me, like something like that, a municipality offering directly to homeowners or landlords assistance, kind of bypassing, because provincial, nothing's happening, it's not sufficient at the federal. And yeah,
just as you're answering that, could you repeat the questions?
Sorry, just a good example. Now, the thing about that kind of situation is that we're in a very small community here. That situation of a larger municipality like Ottawa, for example, or Peterborough, offering, direct grants, kind of that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in small communities, so it's important to hook up and network with your similarly sized communities. That group, I know, Susan, you went to the Perth meeting, and they're doing great things in that area. So I wouldn't discount what the possibilities are by virtue of being small. In fact, even in a small community, especially one like this, there are enormous resources available. On the question of heat pumps and retrofitting the building stock, the heat pumps are, they're fairly economic to do. The retrofit, not so much. They're expensive things to do, the way we've been doing them especially. They're a pain in the neck if you're the homeowner. You know, you've got to find a contractor, you've got to manage it. I mean, can you imagine if we built our highways that way? Maybe we do in some places, but I think in the long term, what has to happen with the residential retrofit is that the capital cost of doing it has to be taken completely off the shoulders of the homeowner, completely. Zero. Doesn't mean they don't pay for it, but just like we don't write a check up front the next time the government wants to build a bridge or a highway. So we need to have a way of taking the capital cost away from being the homeowner's responsibility. Number two, I think we need to also take all of the risk off the homeowner. So we have to guarantee that if this is going to be done to your home, that your total cost of ownership will not go up. Number three, I think we have to minimize the disruption and the inconvenience to the homeowner. We have to find a way to get in and out in days, not months. And then we have to aggregate, and we need to be doing this many buildings at a time in aggregate projects. And it may be that local financing is going to be helpful. I think if you look at what the co-op in Ottawa is doing, for example, in the financing of energy efficiency in the community, there could be a model there that could be applied in Lanark. I know Perth was looking at it when we were there last spring. We did a bit of this in Cobourg. My wife is much more engaged in the local community on these issues than me, but we set up a co-op. It's amazing. We sold bonds in the community, and people were lined up because they were so anxious to take their retirement funds, which are with, you know, this or that major bank doing who knows what, and bring them back into the community. And they were willing to accept fairly low but reasonable rates of return, and that was used to finance solar installations in the community. The same thing can be applied to building retrofits. So I mean, I think that organizing locally, even if it means raising money and raising capital within the community, is probably part of how this is going to unfold. I mean, one thing that really struck me talking to a friend in BC earlier this year, who was had a property right in the middle of the fire zone when it came through in the central interior. Nobody came to help. They didn't have the first fire. If you're the first community to have a fire, you might get a lot of help. But if you're number 5 or 6 or 7, you're going to be on your own. And unfortunately, I think that climate change itself is basically going to require communities to step up. The provincial government, the federal government, there may be some assistance, there may be some financing. You should educate yourself about where those possibilities are and go after them. But try to develop a plan which is really rooted in the community, even with the financing if possible. And if you need to train people to do the retrofits, then make that part of it. Maybe a way of keeping some of your young people in the community. This is, I just don't think it's something that's going to be delivered from Ottawa. Another dimension, there's one more thing I want to say about this local action thing, is that when you talk to local politicians, and you can try this experiment on your own elected officials here, they will usually tell you, nobody ever raises this issue with me. The mayor in my town, when I talk to him, he says, people are not coming up to me on the street and complaining about the climate change problem. It's not because they're not concerned about it. It's just they don't think that the local government is the appropriate level to respond. And so the elected officials of our local governments, a lot of them don't feel particularly pressured or politically motivated to address this issue. And so groups like Environment Halliburton can play a really important role in trying to increase, first of all, education and awareness of the local elected officials about why this is a local issue, why the solutions need to be local, and what local governments can be doing to address it without waiting for the government man to come calling. The FCM has got a program, which you know, you should know about. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities. You want to be plugged into what they're doing. The Clean Air Partnership in Toronto, another organization you want to be plugged into. The Atmospheric Fund, which was started by the City of Toronto, but which is spread out to the Greater Toronto Area. I doubt if it comes this far yet, but they do a lot of good research and publications, but they've also pioneered approaches to the financing of building retrofits in Toronto with models, many of which are transferable. So again, network with other local governments is really important because the ideas are out there, and there are some communities that are quite far along the path of trying to address climate change as a community, and I'd be quite happy to have their ideas taken and applied elsewhere.
So I'm glad you have talked about both global and local, and in the chat box, there's comments that are both on both sides. Some people want to, one question has to do with big picture things like the IPCC and like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the UN Convention, and so on and so forth, and how we actually move things forward, like what happened during the Montreal Protocol to deal with the ozone, right? You know, the crisis on the ozone layer. But there's also a comment actually in here from a local mayor, which I'd like to focus on for a second. It's Bob. I'm going to call you out. Bob Carter is got a comment about the fact that there's not the resources, and there's also, in some sense, political straitjackets, if I can put it that way, that municipalities are caught within, you know, the provincial government, that it limits their capacity to actually take action. So, you know, could you say something about that? Because one of the things, and there's some people here, Brian, you and I sat on the advisory committee with respect to the climate action plan for the county, and I could say to you that the level of ambition was very low, right? Incredibly low, and the feeling that there was just not the resources and capacity to be able to address, and it was better placed at a higher level of government, like the province, and of course the province isn't interested. Could you just say a couple of things about that kind of perceived political and resource straitjacket?
Well, in terms of the resource straitjacket, it never fails to amaze me, the resources that are available, even in small communities, if you go looking for them. One of the things that we used to recommend for communities that were starting down the path of addressing this issue was just do an estimate of how much money is leaving your community to buy fuel and electricity, and what could be done if you could start recycling some of that locally through efficiency investments. Do you know what skills are available in your community to address this problem? Most communities don't know that. They don't do it. But if you were to take an inventory of the skills that are available in this county for addressing this problem, I think it would just be amazing, the expertise that you would find is already out there and the skills that are already out there that are needed to address this. In terms of, this is bootstrap thinking, you know, where instead of saying, well, there's a resource straitjacket, just say, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to, it's a different type of leadership that steps up and says, we are going to find a way as a community to address this. If that means changing the provincial government's rules and restrictions on local governments, then local government leaders need to get organized and do that. The City of Toronto and the City of Vancouver, I think also, mind you, obviously large politically powerful blocks, they started developing standards for new buildings in their community. There's no constitutional or legal basis for them to do that, but they did it anyway. You want to get a building permit in Toronto, you've got to build your building according to these efficiency standards. And they're now in round 3, I think, of doing this. And do you think the provincial government is going to stop them? I don't think so. And so I think it's better to just forge ahead. If some of the restrictions that you're talking about are legal and constitutional ones, just ignore them and see what happens. Because this is a job, it's our constitution after all. And if it's not working for us, then we need we need to try it and test it and push it. In terms of, but there are, having said all of that, there are systemic barriers that are in the form of provincial policies. And those need to be addressed through organizations, I think, like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities or other ways that allow local officials to collectively lobby the Ontario Municipal Association, for example, for the changes that they need. But the local political elected officials are incredibly important people in the minds of the provincial and federal elected officials. If you lose the support of the mayors in Ontario, you're in trouble politically. They're opinion leaders and trendsetters in their communities. And you really don't want them bad-mouthing you if you're a provincial government or a federal government. It's not going to end well. So that's another thing, is you've got to organize and push back against these restrictions. And without being more specific about some of the things that Mayor Carter is referring to, I'm not sure what more I can say, but if there's a straitjacket, it needs to be, it needs to be removed.
Okay, I'm gonna go back into the room then. Anybody got a comment or a question you want to make? We're at about 8:28, so we got about another 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Brian, you want to put a question or make a comment?
Thanks a lot. It was a great presentation. Really great. I have one question for you, and it involves around Ontario's electric infrastructure. So, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States of America has been overwhelmingly successful in the context of renewables. Using the states as a simple example, right now there are hundreds of solar farms recently installed in the last couple of years that are now having to wait 2 or 3 years for their point of perfection, just simply because the infrastructure doesn't exist in the grid. Similarly, here in Ontario, I think it was Hydro One's 2017 annual report, but they noted that 52% of their primary infrastructure is 50 years beyond label. And of course, in Ontario, it is one of the more developed roads. So, the Ford government recently announced a $450 billion estimate to upgrade our infrastructure and generation between now and 2050. The feds have the objective of 30% electric vehicles by 2030, so on and so forth. So my simple question to you is, and I really appreciate your slides on the grid, but how do you see the expansion and security of the grid being enhanced in context to the ratio between public and private money? And that's really what my question is.
Yeah.
Not to rediscover. Yeah. That's my question.
Yeah.
Is it because of course we all know one of the statutes of power is whoever controls the energy. So that's my question. Do you see it as a greater sort of private transition, and what's that public role?
Well, I think there's going to have to be public investment in these solutions. And I think that in the case of electricity, our regulatory framework and the mandate that our utility has gets in the way. They don't have a mandate to address climate change. They may have some political instructions, but their fundamental mandate is to produce kilowatt hours and keep the costs as low as possible. And that was a good idea 50, 60, even 30 years ago, maybe. But right now, that's working against us because, as I said earlier, what people really want is comfortable buildings. And let me just illustrate this. If you have a big utility that has access to capital for, let's say, 3%, and we built a lot of our electricity system with very, very low interest money because it was backed by the government of Ontario, who's not going to like that, with very long paybacks. So they're out there thinking, oh, there's this tsunami of electrification happening in buildings, for example. We better build $400 to $600 billion in order to double the transmission system, build massive wind farms in Northern Ontario. And that $400 to $600 billion that you referred to, that was just to the distribution gauge. didn't take into any consideration what needs to be invested in the communities to adjust to the more intensive neighborhood level use of electricity we're talking about when the EVs and the heat pumps start coming online. So meanwhile, let's say you have a medium-sized office building and you're a private owner of that building and you want to upgrade it, your cost of capital is maybe 7%. So you're looking at the things that you can do to save electricity and the things that you can do to reduce your peak demand for electricity. And when they get below a 6 or a 7% return, you're going to balk because that's your hurdle rate for investment as a private owner of the building. And that's a progressive owner at 6 or 7%. And a lot of private companies are looking for twice that. So you have this imbalance where the public money is getting ready to build $400 to $600 billion of old style electricity supply and distribution with this low cost money. And opportunities, I call them stranded opportunities, exist in all of the buildings that have ways to avoid some of that new energy and to avoid some of that peak demand, but which pay back at a lower rate than what the building owner is willing to accept. So they won't do it. They'll let the utility build the power plant instead. And we all end up losing in that scenario. And these least cost pathway, if you want to call it that, to getting our emissions down doesn't ever get implemented because of this unequal situation we have between the public utility and the buildings, and they're having the same problem with electric vehicle charging infrastructure, getting the connections and so on. Why would the utility be in a hurry to do that? So under their current mandate, so we have a need right across Canada to revisit the regulatory frameworks and the mandates of our public utilities to make sure that they're addressing what we need in the 21st century. And these mandates go back, 100 years. Their basic conceptual structure goes back even longer. So yes, I think public money needs to come in. And right now, it's difficult for it to get in the case of electricity because of this inequitable access to capital.
So I'll go one more, I think we've got time for just one more
Sorry,
short question.
my answers are too
Short
long.
answer. Fortunately, we may have a few minutes, I don't know, of sort of downtime afterwards. We call it official end, but we really do have to be out of the building by 8:45.
Right.
So that's been told to us. Yeah, about 10 minutes. So don't have a lot of time. So there is do you want to ask? a
No,
question?
you ask Bob's question. I have a
Okay,
question.
so there was one more quick kick at the can with respect to politicians, like Bob is talking about. People just don't talk to us about climate change. They don't come up to us and like you were saying, people don't approach politicians and say, my issue is climate change, but they do approach politicians and talk about social housing costs. They do talk about other kinds of issues, as you pointed out, which are directly, when you think about it, related to climate. So could you say something a little bit about that? Because it's important, I think, for us to organize local action, to basically learn how to frame that for our local political leaders so that they understand what people are talking about is a climate issue.
Right. Well, I mean, social housing, does the local government here own and build social housing?
I'd like to.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great example because those buildings need to be zero emission. It's better for the climate, it's better for the tenants, it's better for the investors and everybody. That's win-win-win all around. Is that the kind of thing that
Yeah.
you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, and also that there's like 20 people here, but there's hundreds of people at home that don't care. So how does a politician do the right thing when a lot of the community doesn't care? Or it's not a high enough priority for them. Like, how do we make that shift?
I thought he said one more question.
I did say that it was supposed to be a short question.
Man, if I had the answer to that,
I know,
I-
exactly.
I really don't really get it. I think that our fossil fuel dependence is so deeply ingrained in our infrastructure and in the way we do things and in our consumer culture that people just have a hard time imagining a future without it. And you know, the way the human brain works, if you think a future is not possible, and a lot of people don't believe that it's possible to get past fossil fuel dependence, your brain will go into overdrive to try and convince you that it's not necessary. Because you don't want to believe two things at the same time. One, it's necessary that we get off fossil fuels, and two, it's not possible to get off fossil fuels. So if you have those two cognitively conflicting thoughts going on in your brain, your cognitive biases will go into overdrive to help you believe that we don't have to deal with it. And so I see a lot of that. You'll very rarely, for example, find a climate change denier who doesn't also believe that it's impossible to get off fossil fuels. And I think this is the way a lot of humans reconcile a transition that they just can't imagine with what the scientific evidence is now screaming very loudly at us is you've got to do this. And so everybody's contribution to trying to resolve this conflict, and this is the big one, is going to be different depending on where you stand. If you're a mayor of a local community, I think there's tremendous number of tremendous opportunities for leadership and imagination. What I've done in most of my career is I just try to make it look more and more possible. I try to educate about these technologies, let investors know about it, because I guess underlying that approach is the implicit assumption that if more people could see that there is not only a possible post-fossil fuel version of our society, it's actually pretty cool, no pun intended. You know, it looks pretty good. The economy could be better than the one we're going to get with climate change. The environment could be cleaner, the air could be healthier, the buildings could be better, the cars could be more fun to drive. You just keep working, trying to build up the map of what the new world could look like if we would just open ourselves to it. And that will gradually work. That will gradually eat away at and dissolve this this irrational denialism that keeps a lot of people from looking like they, makes them look like they don't care when really they just can't deal with it.